Kia ora everyone, and welcome to our Goodfellow webinar on chronic conditions and COVID-19 illness. My name is Dr. Courtney White, and tonight we'll hear from Jane Goodwin, a registered nurse working in Advanced Care Planning, the Health Quality and Safety Commission, and the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. I'll now hand over to Jane. Thank you.
Kia ora everybody, it's lovely to join you this evening. We will get the screen up and running and we'll run through the presentation. So we're going to be chatting chronic conditions and how we can be supporting people to sort of think and plan for future care with the potential COVID environment that some of us are currently dealing with and some of us are anticipating is going to be coming our way soon. He uri ahi no te whiti, no kingitanga, kotitanga, po toku tupua. Ka mihi o ki tēnei whenua me ona yuri. Ka mihi o ke te moanga taranaki, ka mihi o ke te moana whakaropo, ka mihi o ke te awa hekateri, no motu karati rahi, te whare kia inga, ko Jane Goodwin taku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As Courtney so nicely introduced me, I am Jane and I am a nurse and I work in advanced care planning and have worked in this space for nearly the last 10 years. So I wear a few hats. I've been involved in the implementation of advanced care planning and the rollout across the district of Waitaha, Canterbury since 2013. I'm one of the lead trainers for the national training program around communication training and serious illness conversation guide. And I also work for the Health Quality and Safety Commission these days as a senior project manager, just picked up the portfolio to roll out shared goals of care. And we'll touch on a little bit of that as we go through this session. So what we're going to talk about as we go through tonight is a little bit of an overview of advanced care planning. I'm hoping it's a concept that a lot of you will understand and know about already and be quite well versed in, but we'll just do a bit of a recap to make sure we're all on the same page around that. And then we'll look at the Serious Illness Conversation Guide and how this fits into the mix of this process. We'll think about using the Serious Illness Conversation Guide to support people to prepare in the context of COVID. And that's both in the context of someone that might have a chronic condition that potentially they're in an environment where it might be impacted if there's COVID in the community or if they develop COVID themselves. I'll introduce you to the Talking COVID website. We'll talk about some of the next steps in the mahi that's coming up, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So as Courtney said, you're welcome to put those in. So pop them in the box as we go, and she will start coordinating those at the end so that we can go through them when we come to the end of the session. Okay. So the old adage in life, the only things you can be sure about in life are death and taxes. I'm sure you're all screaming that at your screen. And I guess one of the things that the last 18 months to 2 years has taught all of us around the world is that we are mortal and that even in the most advanced countries, we are at risk from this nasty little virus called COVID. This was a New York Times article back in March last year, which said it's time to talk about death. The coronavirus pandemic highlights how much we need to have conversations about end-of-life care. And I think it has definitely highlighted to all of us the importance of some of these conversations, both for ourselves, for the people we love, and the people that we are providing care for in our community and hospital settings. And I guess for a number of our patients, especially those with chronic conditions, they have got things going on with their health that mean death is not unexpected at some point in the future. I quite like this cartoon, the Death Reaper knocking on this guy's door saying, don't freak out, it's just to save the date. Well, I'm not here for you today, I am coming back for you in the future. And I think what COVID has done for a lot of our patients with chronic conditions is it's really reminded them about the vulnerability in that space and the fact that if COVID comes a knocking, they are definitely at increased risk. And that's why some of these conversations are so particularly important in this space. So when we think about advanced care planning, what are we talking about? Well, advanced care planning is defined by the Advanced Care Planning Cooperative as a process of discussion and shared planning for future healthcare. It involves the person, it involves the people that are important to them, their whānau, and it's really, really useful if it also involves the healthcare team that's involved in their care. What advanced care planning does is it gives people the opportunity to develop and express their preferences for future care. And that's based on a few things. It's based on who they are as a person, a better understanding of what's happening with their health now and in the future, and an understanding of the treatment and care options that might be available to them. And I really like these 3 bullet points because it reminds us how much this is a team approach. What we as clinicians, people supporting these people's health in the community environments across our primary care sectors, is we're bringing our expertise on those conditions. We're talking to them about what's happening with their health at the moment, what that future might look like, what speed bumps we might anticipate along the way, getting them thinking about what they might like in some of those scenarios and situations, and what treatments are available and appropriate for them, given everything else that's going on in the context of their health. So that's our role in this process. What the person brings to the table, they're the expert on themselves. Nobody knows them better than they do. They know what's important to them. They know their values, their beliefs. They know the things that are keeping them awake at 3 o'clock in the morning worrying about their health. They know what they're hoping for going forward, and they know what their goals are, what feels important, what they're aiming for and trying to achieve. Together with that sense of that real person-centeredness in this conversation and discussion, and with our clinical understanding and knowledge of those disease trajectories, we can often come up with a really great approach as to what's most appropriate for that person, aligning around the things that matter most to them. And that's what advanced care planning is all about. So we've spent quite a bit of time as the advanced care planning team trying to work out how we graphically demonstrate advanced care planning, because we've tried all sorts of things, but it's a bit of a tricky concept to discuss. And we last year had the privilege of working with a graphic designer, and she took the concept of sound waves. And I really like that. It sort of helps us to illuminate that this is a process, and that at different points in our life, with different things going on in our lives, our thinking around what's important to us and planning for our future healthcare and end of life has different amounts of priorities. So there are definitely times in our lives where things might happen to us, for us, to people we love, that really makes us think about these things. And there are other points in our life where it's not something that's very high on the agenda at all, and we mightn't even really consciously be aware of it. And I like this sort of illustration. So when you start looking at some of the things that she's highlighted in this graphic, she's talking about things like when you go to update your will potentially, and the lawyer has a conversation with someone around, okay, so have you got an enduring power of attorney? Nope. Do you need to think about one? If you do they know the things that are important to you? That really starts you thinking about where that happens and what's going on. Someone you know and love might become unwell. It makes you think about what you'd want in that situation. Whānau might move away. You know, the people that have been your support in that community might not be there anymore. Will that make your future look different? You might have a diagnosis of a health event yourself. What does that mean for you in terms of your future? You might need to move home or move house or move into a smaller space. That changes your thinking sometimes about how the future looks. You might have some health complications, some more health events. You might have a fall. That might change what's happening for you. Things might happen that mean you need some increased support in the community. Again, a life event that starts you thinking more about, what's the future going to look like? What's most important to me in this process? So if we then overlay it with how this fits with advanced care planning, it really reminds us that this is a process. These conversations might start when someone's quite well in the community, off the back of that visit to the lawyer, or something's happened to someone you love. This feels important. I want to start thinking and talking and planning for what I want. I might develop my advanced care plan, or I might start having a corridor with the people I love about what I would like in certain situations. It might be something that your practice team support you with to develop and create. You might come into hospital and people might start talking to you around what are your goals for the submission, what feels important, using the shared goals of care framework and the serious illness conversation guide, which we're going to talk a little bit about soon. If you're moving into increased home support or moving into ARC or needing extra care, again, these might be opportunities to be reevaluating and reassessing where things are up to for you. You know, is the documentation, have the things I've talked about, have the things I captured still reflect what I want them to say for where I'm up to now? So it's an opportunity to update, to create, to develop. And then we might be thinking as someone's, starting to lose their ability to communicate or things are changing significantly for their health, that is when those things that they've told us are important to them, those previously made advanced care plans, any advanced directives they have, that's really when that comes into play. And then as those final stages, as that person is dying, we use that to really design and support the care that we're delivering for that person. And it's also when tools like te ara whakapiri might come into the mix and into the process. So this reminds us there's a number of tools that are part of advanced care planning. So advanced care planning is much more than the advanced care plan. And lots of you will be familiar with the booklet that we have that's got sort of a kitty and leaves woven on the front of it. That has got 7 sections, and that's what a lot of people around the country, around the motu, use to be capturing their advanced care planning wishes. But we also have the shared goals of care documentation, which we're going to discuss a little bit more. Essentially, that's a targeted advanced care planning process for an episode of care. And then we have the serious illness conversation guide, which is a way or a tool that supports us to have targeted advanced care planning conversations with someone with a serious illness or a chronic illness. And these kind of all work together. You know, sometimes someone might have an advanced care plan in the community. They might go to hospital for an admission. They might have a shared goals of care discussion in the hospital. They're thinking that they've already done the things they've already captured in their advanced care plan influence what they might tell people in their shared goals of care for that admission. Equally, they might have a hospital admission where the shared goals of care is created, and that makes them think on discharge, do you know what, actually, maybe I need to tell people a little bit more about what's important to me, and I might make my advanced care plan. Equally, the serious illness conversation guide, supporting some of these discussions as people are articulating and talking about what matters to them, what worries them, what are the conditions that they are concerned about, what helps them through the tough times, what abilities are so important to them they can't imagine living without them. Again, that might help and inform some of the thinking back to updating their advanced care plan as well. So it kind of becomes a bit of a process that we can work around, and over time, those tools will help us navigate different parts of the process. So the bit that we're specifically going to be talking about for the majority of the night tonight is the serious illness conversation guide. So the guide was initially developed in Ariadne in the States. It came off the back of work done by Atul Gawanda when he was doing the work around writing his book, Being Mortal. And essentially, it's a set of structured questions that help clinicians have conversations with seriously ill people and their whānau about what's most important to them if time were limited or their functional abilities were to change. So it's very much about hearing from the person about what matters to them, more than it is about making treatment decisions and choices. And the guide is essentially a collection of patient-tested language that help us navigate different parts of a conversation structure. And the conversation structure will look really familiar to any of you that have done any comms work, which I'm guessing most of you all have. It's about a setup, it's about assessment, it's about sharing, it's about exploring, and it's about closing. So the structure feels really familiar to a lot of you, I'm sure. What the Serious Illness Conversation Guide does is it uses patient-developed and patient-tested language to provide clinicians with some words to navigate the different parts of the conversations. And we know that when people are in stressful situations and having these discussions, which are often a little bit anxiety-producing, it's really helpful to have language to turn to use, so you're not spending your whole time thinking, where do I go next? What do I say? That's in front of you. That gives you a bit more brain space to be hearing what that person is telling you, understanding what they're saying. And you know that the language is patient-tested, which means, or patient developed, which means you can trust the wording around it, that the majority of people it resonates well and makes sense to them. So this is the Serious Illness Conversation Guide Aotearoa. I think it's about version 105 of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, because as it's grown and developed and matured over time and been taken to different countries and updated and adapted, it's changed. So the version that came to us from the States, while the concepts felt really familiar and really good, the language itself was, I guess, a bit Americanized. It didn't quite sit with how we might say some of these things in New Zealand. So we took it on a road trip around the motu, and we did co-design workshops across the country with consumers and clinicians. And this is the version that they helped us come up with language that they felt resonated and worked in the New Zealand context. And there's some bits that are different than anywhere else in the world. When we were working in Northland with a strongly Māori community, they talked to us a lot about how important it was that we really were checking in to make sure that the right people were at that conversation. So there's a specific prompt just to double check before you go on to make sure that the right people are in the room in this space. This is an important conversation. Would you like someone to be here with you? So there are parts of this that are uniquely Aotearoa in that space. So when we look at the guide in a little bit more detail, we can see that it's got 6 distinct sort of processes. And unashamedly, this is a conversation with an agenda, and the agenda is to understand what matters to that person, what's important to them. So the agenda is not to be making resuscitation decisions or clinical decisions. It's about hearing from that person about what matters to them in the context of their life at the moment and what they see potentially happening in the future. So it starts with setup, and this is set up for the use of the guide. It's not set up for the conversation itself. Obviously, you will do your usual rapport development, your whakapanangatanga as you're meeting that person, as you're developing that relationship. But for the actual conversation, we have our processes of the setup of this part of the discussion. We assess the person's understanding of their health, and we clarify what information they would like from us. How much do you want to know? We share a patient-centered prognosis, and the guide provides us with 3 options that we can use in terms of patient-tested language to deliver some of this prognostic statement. Now, this is not a tool to be using to be delivering bad news to someone for the first time, but sharing an understanding of what's happening for that person is a way of making sure we're in a similar place, and it provides us with an opportunity to be unpacking and hearing from that person about what matters to them in the context of things potentially changing going forward. So I know we often think about prognostic statements as a time-based approach, and there is some language for a time-based prognosis captured within the guide. I wish this were not the case, but I am concerned that time may be as short as what you express in a range. So there is language to support that. But there's also language to support other ways of delivering some prognostic information. So, and I think these particular statements are often really useful when we've got patients that have got some of these chronic conditions that you'll all be very familiar with, and that kind of roller coasterness of things happening for them, ups and downs, and we're not quite sure where things are going. Or if we are potentially nursing and allied health, where time-based is not something we're as comfortable in terms of prognostic statements. So sometimes it's really helpful and useful to be using the things that we feel more comfortable with in terms of function. So the uncertainty prognostic statement that says it can be difficult to predict what will happen with your health. I hope you will continue to live well for a long time, but it is possible you could become unwell quickly, and it's important that we prepare for that possibility. So it's a really nice prognostic statement if you're wanting to hold some hope, but also wanting to get people thinking a little bit about plan B. Things don't go so well. What would be important for you? And it would be good to prepare just in case things don't happen the way we'd like them to. And then function can be really useful as well. I hope this is not the case, but I am concerned that this may be as well as you feel and things are likely to get worse. I find function sometimes particularly useful when you've got a patient or a whānau who haven't kind of grasped that things might change over time for them in terms of their condition. A really good example was someone I worked with probably a couple of years ago now. It was pre-COVID, and he, I'd been asked to support him with an advanced care plan and developing an advanced care plan for him. And when I rang him to have the first conversation with him, he was very clear right up front. He sort of said to me, so they've told me I've got probably 6 or 7 months to live. Yeah, I'm really on board with that. I understand that. So he was very clear that he was palliative and that time was relatively short in a number of months. But then as we continued the conversation, he proceeded to tell me about the fact that he was so looking forward to this cruise that he'd booked for his family. And I said, oh, when are you hoping to go away on that? Because he was going to take them on this amazing cruise and they were going to have this wonderful time. And when I unpacked that a little bit more, he told me that he'd booked it for sort of 5 months' time. And this was an opportunity, I guess, where I rolled out the function statement and I said to him, you know, I hope this isn't the case, but I am concerned that this might be as well as you feel, that things could get worse. And he was like, because I think he thought he was just going to stay just like he was now, and then suddenly at that sort of 6-7 month mark he was going to drop off his perch. And it really resonated with him, the fact that actually things might change, and if I'm as well as I am now, this might be the point that I need to be doing these things that feel most important. So I was really delighted when they moved that cruise forward and they got to spend some time together as a whānau in that space. Then we get into the real heart of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, and that's hearing from the person, eliciting their priorities, their worries and their strengths, and exploring their critical abilities, their trade-offs, and how much their family know about the things that are important to them. And then at the end of the process, we make a recommendation, and that recommendation is summarising what we've heard from the person about what's important and what matters to them, and then thinking about what the next steps might be. And those next steps can be very much aligned with what your clinical role is, what your scope of practice is. It might be that it's actually we need to have some more conversations. It might be I need to go away and talk to some of the specialist teams about some of the things that you're telling me are important so we can get a better sense of what we do. It might be actually I think that we need to write some of this stuff down in an advanced care plan so it's there going forward. It might be that that conversation helps us make some decisions about what our goals of care are going forward, what treatments we're going to offer, where things are going to be for someone. So we can adjust what we recommend based on what we've heard, what's important to that person, and what our scope of practice is in that space. So by the start of 2020, we had introduced the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. It had been in the country for sort of just on 12 months, and we'd done a couple of rounds of training with DHB staff and had a number of DHB staff around the motu trained to deliver the 3-hour advanced care planning, the 3-hour Serious Illness Conversation Guide workshop, which is helping people to learn to use the guide. We developed a number of tools to sit with us. So we had the guide itself, but we also had a reference manual that was helping clinicians post the conversations to sort of be thinking about the things that needed to happen in that mix. We had developed some tools around whānau and patient preparation. There was a whole lot of stuff that was being developed, and we'd also been working with DHBs to think about the systems they needed to put in place. Who were they going to identify to have these conversations with? How are they going to capture it within a system? How is that going to be documented? How is that documentation going to be retrieved? How are people going to know about this? How are we going to support people in the mix? Those aspects of implementation and system change. So that's kind of where we were at the start of 2020. Enter COVID, dun dun. And suddenly things kind of ratcheted up a level, and everybody started thinking about how we were going to be working the best we could in the most effective and efficient way to be understanding what mattered to people. We sort of saw this huge cloud of COVID rolling towards us. We weren't sure what the future was going to look like. We weren't sure how overwhelmed our system was going to be. And it felt really important that these conversations were happening in a timely way. I had a lot of conversations with clinicians around the country saying, we need to be doing advanced care planning, but we haven't really got time to do an advanced care plan because it takes time and people need to think about it, which they absolutely do. So the Serious Illness Conversation Guide gave us a way of having a really targeted conversation with someone around what was most important to them in this context. And so very quickly, the Health Quality and Safety Commission Advanced Care Planning team, with some help from some amazing clinicians around the motu, pulled together the Talking COVID website, which is still available on the Commission website. And you'll see that there was a number of aspects that kind of started to evolve and develop as the sort of preparation for COVID unfolded. So there's the Serious Illness Conversation Guide on there. There was the development of shared goals of care documentation, which I'll talk about shortly. There was training and teaching resources for the Serious Illness Conversation Guide. There was specific resources developed to be supporting the aged residential care sector. There were demonstrations and ways of having these conversations with patients in whānau who were COVID positive. And then there was a link back to the wider advanced care planning processes that people might also be feeling were important to be doing in preparation for this COVID rolling on in. So quite quickly, and with a lot of conversations with our colleagues in countries like America and Canada and the UK, we were hearing the value that the original or the Aotearoa version of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide were going to have in this context. So particularly for our patients with chronic conditions or existing serious illnesses, this was a way of really sort of eliciting from them relatively quickly. Often these conversations take between 8 and 14 minutes. What is important to you? What matters? Things are changing. What do we need to be considering for you? And this worked really well in the context of COVID. So on the screen there is one of our example webinars that we created. And there were some example conversations. That's with one of our palliative care colleague clinicians, Lynn. And she was talking to Oleg around, in a character role, around what he would want if things changed for him. And he was playing the role of a patient with a palliative oncology diagnosis. And so there was, because of the heightened awareness of COVID, I guess, his character was asking questions. Are you asking me this stuff because of COVID? Is this what? And she could navigate that really well, but the guide still provided a great structure for thinking about what this was going to mean, particularly because he was going to be at higher risk of COVID because of his immune compromised status in that role. And also because we were aware that his usual health condition might be compromised. Things are going to look potentially different. And we're seeing that playing out now, and we've seen it play out over the last 18 months. And the fact that some of the ways that we've interacted with the health system previously have changed now. We don't have the opportunity to have as many people there. We don't have the support networks available. We have to think of other ways of communicating. So things were going to change potentially, and this was a way of understanding what mattered most in that context. And I touched very briefly on some of the additional considerations, and I guess one of the things we heard a lot from our clinician colleagues around the country was this was providing, in this COVID sort of environment, a way that we could have the conversation, which was really important, but we were also wanting to understand things like, where did the person want to be? And suddenly that took on a slightly different context. You know, there was a number of people that were making choices to say, you know, if I did get sick, I wouldn't want to go to hospital anymore because I wouldn't be able to have my whānau with me. You know, no visiting in the hospitals meant that the people I love and want around me in my final days and hours wouldn't be able to be there. So I might make choices to be cared for in a home environment, whereas I may previously have decided that I wanted to be somewhere else instead. Who I want to have with me, what matters to me, what's that going to look like if visiting is restricted? I work as my sort of day job locally here in Waitaha, and Christchurch Hospital is a very clear at the moment one visit policy, one visitor policy. So when you've got someone that is in those final stages and final days of their life, it's a really big deal when that whole whānau can't gather and be there and support them on those final days. What it was meaning about visitation, what it was meaning about how we connected with people. You know, I know a number of the hospitals around the country, and I'm sure that a number of the primary care teams and practice teams started thinking about this as well. How do we connect people up? What do we do in terms of electronic connectivity? How do we let these whānau be there and share in these discussions and support this person, even if they can't physically be in that space? And that took quite a lot of coordination in a number of areas around how does this work? What do we do? Do we have enough devices? Do the people have their own devices? Do they know how to access the different apps on these devices to make these things work? So there was a whole layer of consideration that came into the mix around this. And then there was the huge and very significant impact on funeral and tangihanga wishes. And this was something we've heard a lot from our Māori communities about, the huge in the advanced care planning space. We've had a lot of discussions about, you know, the things I've said were important to me in terms of my tangihanga, how I wanted that to be, what I hoped for in that space suddenly looked very, very different. And that's quite a big deal for me. And that's a really big deal for the people that love me and support me and are in that mix for me. So there was a number of additional considerations that coming in the mix, both at the time we were making some of these current decisions for people, but it was also impacting people's existing advanced care planning decisions and preferences. And we saw a number of people choosing to update their plans in the context of what they saw was coming. So we also were learning very quickly from a number of our colleagues, particularly the team at Ariadne, who developed the original Serious Illness Conversation Guide. They were based out of Boston, and as you'll probably be aware, that was one of the really hard hit places early on in the pandemic. And they did quite a lot of work to adjust and adapt their guide. They took a slightly different approach to it than we did here in Aotearoa, but these are the two versions that we developed here for COVID positive patients or whānau of people who are COVID positive. So it used the structure, but it changed it up just a little bit. So let's look a little bit more closely at what we did. So if we're looking at the guide for a patient who is COVID positive, we've acknowledged right up front that we're sorry they're in this situation, whatever that is, whether they've come to hospital or that you're feeling so unwell, and the importance of giving them the best care at this difficult time, and how the reason that we were wanting to understand and ask some of these questions was that we might be able to help understand what was most important to them in the context of what might be coming up. One of the things we learned from our colleagues in Boston, that our sort of normal question about how much information do you want from me was something that they were saying actually was quite a challenging question to ask, because especially early on in the pandemic, we didn't actually have a lot of information about what things might look like or what was going on. So it was a question that we chose to leave off the guide in this context because of what we'd learned from our colleagues overseas. There's still the very important part in the mix around who do you want to have with you? How can we connect potentially with those people that are important to you to be involved in this conversation? And then helping to understand their information and what they understand is happening for them at the moment. And then the share section looked a little bit different. So rather than a prognostic statement, we've kind of divided it up into what you might say if it's believed that recovery is hopeful, if you believe recovery might be uncertain for that person, or that things are looking imminently like they're drastically changing and that it's likely the person may not survive this episode. So you can see the language that sort of sits in that space. When it comes to the explore section, we've really refined that down. So we're understanding about what are their priorities if their health does get worse, despite everything we're doing, what their worries are, what abilities are so important to them they can't imagine living without them, and if their health does get worse, how much they're willing to go through the possibility of more time. And obviously we've got a statement there that you do need to be mindful with your clinical judgment about what's appropriate for that person and their capacity to be having those conversations depending on how unwell they are. And then we close it by providing a statement around what we think the next steps might be. So aligning what the person has told us with some of the goals of care that we're aware might need to be happening for them in that space. So you'll see there is 4 options, and they relatively closely align to the work that was happening in the background at the same time of this around shared goals of care, which we're going to chat about shortly. Okay. At the bottom of the form, we also just reminded people about how this looked and what it was. So it was a 2-pager, double-sided, so it was easy to have if people needed to have something as a prompt in those spaces. It's something that could be taken into a room and then disposed of in that space if they needed to. And it just helped to remind them about the things they needed to be thinking about in the background during this conversation. The importance of allowing some silence and space to acknowledge the emotion and what comes up for that person. The importance that we're affirming our commitment to that person, that we're taking time to gather before we give. So those key concepts of our communication training. So alongside the development of the tools, we also developed a whole lot of training resources. Some of these from the comfort of our bedrooms and home offices in the midst of the COVID crisis. I think there's one video that you can hear my nieces and nephews banging upstairs as they were running around like elephants as we were doing some of the filming. But it's a way of just sort of trying to help in the context of where we were at in the country at the moment, giving our clinicians something to be using to be preparing for what might be ahead in terms of these conversations. So we developed training resources. We delivered a couple of webinars that are recorded and available to see, particularly around the use of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide COVID, and how we might have that discussion with whānau as well, so written in third person. And we also developed some ARC-specific resources because very quickly we were hearing from the aged residential care sector that these conversations were incredibly needed, and especially when we started looking at locally here in Canterbury, one of our facilities unfortunately contracted COVID, and the country was very aware of the outcome of that. these were really important conversations to be having with a number of those people in that space. So a whole suite of resources were developed specifically for the ARC setting. So while there was a huge amount of mahi going on in the background to be pulling all this stuff together, we also had, I guess, the opportunity with COVID that it was a bit of a catalyst. It suddenly got the ball rolling for a whole lot of things. So I've mentioned Shared Goals of Care a few times. Shared Goals of Care is a process that's a national program. It was led by the Health Quality and Safety Commission. It was part of the patient deterioration workstream, and it was the third part of that program. So you guys are probably quite familiar with the New Zealand Early Warning Score or Early Warning System, use Korero Mai, which was encouraging patients and whānau to escalate their concerns and worries if someone was unwell and things were changing. And then Shared Goals of Care was the third prong in this. And while it started in the patient deterioration program, it's now been incorporated into the National Advanced Care Planning program within the Commission as well. And what Shared Goals of Care is it's essentially a way of helping to explore what's important to that person and align what matters to them with some agreed goals of care about what's clinically appropriate for this episode of care should the patient deteriorate. So I guess instead of often we think binarily in the sort of concepts of DNA CPR, we either are or we aren't resuscitating. This helps us to sort of navigate the bits that sit in between that in terms of, well, we mightn't be resuscitating this person necessarily, but there's a whole lot of stuff we do want to do. This helps us to sort of capture where that person sits in that continuum. So at a minimum, what we hope for Shared Goals of Care is that the overall direction for the episode of care is identified, whether that's going to be a curative goal, whether that's restorative, whether it's about improving quality of life, or whether it's comfort whilst dying. And we can also, within that, agree some limitations on medical treatment if that's required. And the reason that this felt really important was we know that deterioration can happen anytime, and often it happens before we've clarified some of these conversations. We know both anecdotally and from research from across the world that the sooner we recognise deterioration, the better the outcomes are for someone. We also know that it's really important that we have the opportunity to be documenting and recording what's important to that person, and the sooner we do that, the better. And we know that the earlier we have these discussions and document a patient's goal of care, it helps us to respond when that person deteriorates in a way that aligns with their wishes. Dr. Alex Sarides, who used to lead the Shared Goals of Care program in patient deterioration, used to talk about the fact that, so often patients get on a treadmill. I think we've probably all seen this in our clinical practice, where suddenly someone arrives in hospital and they're unwell, and suddenly they're on this treadmill of all these tests and all these treatments, all these things happening. And for some patients, that's completely appropriate and it's absolutely what they want. For others, though, that mightn't be what they think is important for them, but no one's ever sort of stopped to check in with them about how this is feeling for them. What are their goals? What is feeling most important? Are they wanting this incredible input? Or is there another way we could be caring and supporting them depending on what's most important to them? So I guess the purposes of Shared Goals of Care are to proactively align patient, whānau and clinician goals as part of the advanced care planning process. It's about focusing on more what we can do rather than what we can't do. And it's often about talking to people about how would you like to be on the other side of this? What's important to you? So it's not necessarily about having the specific discussion with the person about the ins and outs of every single treatment option. This is about what matters to you in terms of quality of life. What do you want to look like on the other side of this? And it's about agreeing a direction of care for that specific episode. So that might be an admission to hospital, it might be admission to aged residential care, and we'll talk shortly about some of the ways we're looking at potentially using this in a community setting as well for a defined episode of care, being COVID. So as we developed these resources, we started thinking about how do we do this? What do we need to do? So this is encouraging people to do some preparation around this. You'll see there are things in there around thinking about who we need to be having these conversations with, thinking about our own implicit bias as we have this, doing the preparation, understanding what treatments might be appropriate and available for them, having the conversations with the wider team, being ready for that discussion, and then actually having the kōrero with the person. And we encourage the use of the Serious Illness Conversation Guide as a framework to do that. And then developing the Shared Goals of Care document, which captured both the discussion and the decision, and then using that to support treatment if that person was to deteriorate, and having opportunities at different points to be reviewing it if things change with the person. So work had been underway in the country around developing the Shared Goals of Care framework, and Waitemata and Mid Central had been used as sort of pilot sites, and they were about to roll all this out and be seeing how it went. But with COVID looming, we were getting calls from all around the country saying, how do we capture this? How do we report this? How do we do this? So the decision was made that we would release the documentation in advance of it being fully piloted, and actually use COVID as an opportunity for people around the country, clinicians around the country, to actually pilot it in real life. This meant that we had the opportunity to be using consistent language across the country. And in that moment of crisis, with all those things happening, the last things clinicians and facilities needed to be doing was developing their own documentation. This made it much easier by saying, here you go, here's some documentation. So there are some key sort of principles that underpin this. There's actually 10, but this is a bit of a summary of what they are. And it's really about making sure that these are conversations we're having in the hospital environment, with ideally going forward all adult patients, that they're culturally safe, that they happen in an appropriate environment, that the right people are facilitating these discussions, that we're seeing this as a team approach and not just one clinician that does it, that we're starting as early as we can in that admission process, that we're documenting and sharing this information appropriately, and that we're recognising that this is a process and there might be points in time where we need to review and update this documentation as things change for that person. So off the back of COVID and this decision to release early, we developed 2 main documents that we put out to the country. The first was in an acute setting, and there's 3 versions of this depending on how the acute settings in different parts of the country do their kind of a risk call elevation process. And then we developed a document for the aged residential care setting. And the first part of the document captures the discussion, and we use the SICG framework to support that, the Serious Illness Conversation Guide framework to support that. And then the decision is how we are sort of capturing the opportunity for the goals of care for that person. And there are 4 that we have identified in that space. So the first is curative and restorative, in terms of basically we're throwing the kitchen sink at this person. That's what they want. That's what we think is appropriate in that mix. And that we would attempt CPR if they were to have a cardiac arrest. Goal B is curative and restorative, but in this situation, it would be believed that CPR may not be effective or appropriate for that person, or that the person themselves does not want that. Option C is about improving quality of life. So our goal of care for that episode of care is to manage and maintain quality of life and enhance well-being. So the treatments that we're going to offer and use for that person are things that are going to be easily tolerated, that are going to be appropriate, that aren't going to be burdensome to that person. In this situation, we wouldn't be attempting CPR, and it's unlikely that we'd be wanting to be escalating this person to ICU. And there's an opportunity for the clinical team to be talking about whether escalation and calling a call for the sort of support teams would be appropriate or not. And then the final goal of care, goal D, is about comfort whilst dying. So that's really when we'd be thinking about those final days of life for someone, making them as comfortable as possible. That's our focus for that episode of care. So we're at a point at the moment where the majority of DHBs across the motu have committed to using shared goals of care going forward, and are starting to look at how they implement this into their systems. Some DHBs are further ahead with this than others. Some are doing pilot sites. Some are working across their wider system. So it's something that in the acute space, you guys are likely in primary care to start seeing filtering out, because we're really encouraging people to think about how they share some of these discussions and decisions as that person is discharged from the acute side as well, so that you guys out there in the community get a sense of what conversations have happened, what decisions were made for that episode of care, and it provides you with a really good springboard for those next step conversations that you might have yourselves. And we've also got a number of the big aged care providers who are picking up this is their documentation framework and are running training around the country to support this as well. So it's definitely something you're going to be seeing more and more of as we go forward. So where we are at, I guess, at the moment with all of this, and actually just today, we were having conversations with the Ministry of Health, and in the context of COVID, one of the things that they're talking about is how can we be optimising our care for our patients in the community that are COVID positive. We know that they're more likely to deteriorate quickly. It's useful to have a sense of what's important to that person if that is to happen. And so we're in discussions about developing a COVID-specific shared goals of care form to support the community response. And that's something that, that's sort of hot off the press. So if anybody would be keen out there in the community to be supporting us with some of that work, to be providing some your wisdom and guidance and your understanding in the primary care space around this, please get in touch. That's my email there. We'd love to have you involved in some of our works around this. We always do our very best to be working in a collaborative and a patient and provider-centered way in terms of hearing what, you guys are the experts in these spaces. We have the skills and resources to develop some of the resources, but it's most useful if it's led and useful for the people that are on the ground doing this. So co-design is definitely the way we like to go, and we'd love you involved if you were keen. I guess that kind of brings us to the end of the session in terms of the formal slides. So just kind of as a little bit of a recap, that sort of sense that advanced care planning is a process, that there's a number of tools that we can use along the way to support those discussions, whether it's the traditional plan that people are used to, whether it's the serious illness conversation guide to be having more targeted conversations, and the shared goals of care process to be capturing what's important for an episode of care for someone. And how with the onset of COVID, it's given us the opportunity to develop and refine some of those resources to be more COVID specific, to be supporting both patients that might have the condition or also the whānau of those that have got something going on for them. So in this evolution about how we might look and use this in the community is where we're kind of up to next. So I will, I've got just the bottom strip at the bottom there, that is the direct link to the Talking COVID page where all those resources that I've kind of put up today can be found. It's a great hub, so definitely worth a visit if you guys are keen to look at a little bit more of that. So I will stop sharing and we can have a bit of a chat.
Thank you very much. That was such a great overview. A few questions, and everyone, if you want to ask a question, it's just down the bottom at the Q&A option. So are the advanced care plans or the serious illness conversation guide, are they the same across all DHBs or being used by all DHBs?
Yeah, vast majority, absolutely. So the Bay of Plenty had developed their own documentation for advanced care planning, but they're actually now aligning back to the national form as well. It just makes it really easy as people are moving around the country. And while different DHBs and different districts and regions have different ways of communicating that, some have quite established and connected IT systems that allow it to be sort of shared across sectors. Those in Te Waipounamu, those in the South Island will know that with Health One, Health Connect South, but those in the North Island, some of those systems are a bit more fragmented. But having a single document really helps, because even if the systems don't quite connect up, clinicians are familiar with that single document, and it makes sense if someone brings it in or if whānau bring in this document, it's something that people are familiar with in that space. So yeah, the country are pretty much all using the single document in that mix. Serious illness conversation guide similarly, there sort of is one. As I said, there's the few adaptions, the COVID version, and for those that might have been involved in sort of some of the preparatory thinking around how we're going to support conversations around assisted dying, they'll see that we also used sort of the framework for the serious illness conversation guide to develop how we might respond to someone with some patient designed language as well in that context as well. So that was work we've recently done with the ministry. But the framework is really useful to sort of help us navigate and provide clinicians with easy to use language to help you through those sticky, tough conversations.
Are the advanced care planning, the serious illness conversation guide, is that kind of being made known to patients, or is that something that mostly practitioners should be initiating?
Yeah, so there's a real mix of that happening, and some of it depends on what's happening across different districts with how much FTE or if any FTE is available to sort of implement and support this. So, for example, here in Canterbury, where this has been my job and I've got new colleagues picking up and working in this role, we do a lot out in the community. We do community events, we do lots of community presentations, we go to Healthy Day at the PAR, we do sort of expo days, we do all sorts of things to really be elevating and helping people understand in the community that this is available and how it works in our local area in terms of making this happen. Other areas don't have the luxury of having people that it's their designated role to do that. And so in those situations, it's definitely probably a little bit more on the clinician's role to sort of be saying, have you heard of this? This might be important. There is quite a lot of work happening around campaigns. We used to do a once yearly campaign to kind of highlight this, but we're now just this last 12 months moved to quarterly campaigns to just keep it fresher in people's minds and help get it out there, and targeting different communities across the board to help raise awareness around it. So unfortunately, despite we've sometimes thought we've had some amazing stories that we were going to get great buy-in from the media, but it doesn't sort of tick the sexy boxes, I don't think, in terms of healthcare discussions talking about death and dying. So we find it pretty hard to get major media often to sort of buy in and be promoting this. I have to say Māori television have been amazing in the last 12 months, and they've done a lot of work in this space to support and promote as well, which has been really hugely appreciated and great to be able to get it out to those communities as well.
How can primary care or GP practices access the forms? There was one, I think, in a couple of slides ago for acute hospital, one for age residential. Is there one that GP practices can use?
Yeah, okay, so I guess the best place if you're wanting any of these resources is to go to the Health Quality and Safety Commission, the Advanced Care Planning website, which is www.myacp.org.nz, and that will take you to the link to the Talking COVID page as well. And on there, you can download the Shared Goals of Care documentation, the Serious Illness Conversation Guides, and can order any of the hard copy of the Advanced Care Planning resources that will get shipped out free of charge to you as well. At the moment, there is not a community-specific Shared Goals of Care form, and that's because it's around an episode of care, and there's some legality around making choices in advance when it's a clinical decision that we need to be very clear what that definition of episode of care is. And that's why these conversations have just started with the ministry around the fact that COVID could be a really discrete and well-defined episode of care. So if that person is COVID positive, that would give us an opportunity to develop this community form for COVID positive patients, and it would take into account everything else that's going on with them health-wise for that context of their time with COVID. And that's what we'd really love if anybody out there is keen to be involved and helping us with some of that design and input. We'd love it, because we're hoping to sort of be able to get something out in the next sort of 6 weeks to be supporting that community response. There's also work happening to be thinking about how we do other community episodic forms as well, whether someone's having community dialysis, whether that's someone having transfusions, coming into the transfusion centre regularly, patients that are in the system regularly that probably have some really clear wishes, and there's some things we need to know clinically if they were to deteriorate, what we do and how we escalate that, but they're not actually in that acute environment as an admitted inpatient. So those are some of those defined episodes that we're looking at being able to start developing some documentation around. We're also working with the prisons at the moment as well, and looking for some of their sort of high needs prisoners with significant conditions as well, opportunities to be using that as a test site as well, to be looking at how we can use this documentation to support their care and escalation as well.
Once we fill in ACP or the serious illness form, where do we keep it? And is there a way of, particularly the ACP, is there a way of maybe letting other practitioners like ambulance staff or hospital staff know that the patient has that document?
Cool. So that really depends on where in the motu you hang out. So if you're in the South Island, for example, there's a really established system, Health One, Health Connect South. Anyone hanging out in the South Island, those will be very familiar terminologies. And there are clear processes in place in terms of that you can load that electronically, and that then can be shared across the system. So that's available to our primary care clinicians, it's available to our acute hospitals, most of our hospice services. We're onboarding more and more of our aged residential care services, and our ambulance crews as well. Our control centres across the South Island have access to those resources. So in the South Island, it's quite a well-established system so that people can access it and use it as they need to across the sectors. North Island has a varying degree of that. Different DHBs have slightly different approaches. If you go to the Advanced Care Planning website, there's a map of the country, and you can click on that, and it sort of talks a little bit. It's mainly designed for consumers about how you do it in your local area, but it's also quite helpful for clinicians to know who our local touchstone is, who is our person that we can talk to about this, how does it look in our district or our area, and they will help guide you with how it looks in your local area and how that happens, because it's a little bit different across other parts of the country.
Sure. Any tips on how we best prepare ourselves for these kind of conversations?
Yeah, they can be tough conversations, can't they? And I guess they're big. And I think preparing is really important. I think there's that sort of pre-work you need to do yourself around how you feel about this, where this is up to. There's also that work to do, I guess, after you've had a conversation, to be reflecting on how was that, how did it go, what bits worked, what bits didn't. I think frameworks like the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, if these are conversations you don't have often, they can be really useful to sort of use to start with, because they provide you with that language that helps you navigate the tricky parts of the conversation without you having to come up with amazing words to do it. They're kind of there in front of you, and that can be really, really helpful in that space. There's lots of tips and tricks on the website. There are 4 e-learning modules that people can do in preparation, and the majority of the districts around the country also run one-day advanced care planning workshops, which are a great way of really honing your skills, thinking about how you introduce this to people, thinking about how you capture the nuances of what someone might say in a way that's clinically interpretable within the advanced directive portion, are really useful. So have again, that sort of map of the country with the different bits. That also give you a sense of who your key people are to be touching base with, to see what training is available in your district and area as well.
What would your approach be, or what would your advice be in terms of broaching this conversation and someone who's previously been quite closed to it or doesn't want to engage?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I've learned over many years of having these conversations, if you sort of often go into someone and say, you know, do you want to talk about advanced care planning, or I'd like to talk to you about what you'd like. Often people are like, no, thanks very much. It's much better if you kind of, I guess I often talk to people about, you need to find a hook, you need to find something that relates and resonates with them as to why this is important. And often it's about sort of understanding what's going on for them, what are the things they're worried about at the moment, what feels important to them going forward. And that often then gives you the ability to be sort of getting them to think about, what do we need to say here? You know, what feels important? Helping people realise that actually they do have thoughts about this, that most people do have an opinion about certain aspects of this. And once you start surfacing what some of those things are, then you can say, actually, this feels really important. Other people could do with knowing about this as well. You know, it'd be great for your whānau to know this, or it'd be really important for us caring for you to know about this. If something changes, we want to be making sure we give you the best care, and this helps us do that. So rather than sort of doing it, would you like to? Because you usually get it, no thanks. Sort of, yeah, introducing it in a way, sort of sliding it in there a little bit, unpacking a little bit about what's going on for that person, what's happening with their health, and the things they worry about going forward. And then that's an opportunity to say, actually, some of this is important. We need to capture it. It would be really good to write it down so it's there for people to refer to. And that's often a really good way of kind of getting people in that space thinking about it. And also it makes it feel relevant to them rather than sort of a stock standard, we're doing this for everybody. It's actually, this is important for you, and it's important for me as the person caring for you to know this stuff.
It's probably going to vary between people, but in terms of the advanced care plan and the serious illness conversation, how long would you expect those to take?
Yeah, piece of string. So in this there's been a lot of research done in the States around how long the serious illness conversation guide structure takes. They believe an average of 14 minutes. I have seen an amazing conversation done by Dr. Tammy Pegg, who's one of our cardiologists in Nelson, Marlborough. She did the most phenomenal conversation with huge amounts of content in 8 minutes. Yeah, I think one of the things I've learned over the years of teaching and supporting people in this space is that these are they're big conversations in terms of one of the premises of the guide is that the person talks more than we do. We're quite good at talking at people for 8 or 10 minutes and telling them stuff. This is kind of flips it on its head, and it's actually asking us, we're asking open questions, and we're spending more time hearing from them. And we're hearing quite big stuff. You know, those questions are specifically designed in a way that they elicit different information and that they build on each other and that they have a nice psychological flow so that we're not, that we're kind of going from high to a lower to a high again. So we're kind of easing someone through that discussion. And I guess what we find as we do that is that sometimes it feels big. I've got a demonstration video I use, which I think is 11 minutes. And I used it in a session the other day and someone went, oh my God, it was like half an hour. I was like, no, it wasn't. But I think it felt like half an hour because it was big and you were hearing all this stuff. But actually, sometimes it's quite short. And that investment of that time, of that conversation up front can make such a difference, not only to the relationship you have with that person going forward, but also what it means in terms of as things change, how you can kind of pick up and revive that conversation without having to do all that pre-work as things are deteriorating and changing for them. And I think over time, especially if shared goals of care becomes more prevalent in our hospital systems, people are going to be more familiar with people asking them these kind of questions as they're coming in. So I think it's going to also help them to be more confident answering and responding when we're having these discussions in the community. The bigger advanced care plan, how long's a piece of string? The fastest I've ever done was about 20 minutes. This person completely knew what she wanted. I just gave her somewhere to write it down and she just zoomed it. The longest it's taken me is 2.5 years in terms of getting someone across the line with a plan. She had written it, we'd captured it, we'd had the conversations, we'd documented it, and she just took her a long time to get to a point that she wanted to put her name on it and say, yeah, this is what it is. So it's really individual with that person. And it depends on where they're up to with their thinking. There's often questions in there that sort of feel a bit tougher for people and they need to sit with them for a while. What I would really encourage everyone to do is actually think about doing your own. It's a really good way of not just becoming familiar with the questions, but it also helps you think about how some of those questions make you feel. And sometimes the questions that we find harder to answer ourselves are the questions we find harder to ask people about as well. So it's a really good sort of self-reflection. How this feels for me, what's this like? It also helps you realise that you do need to spend a bit of time thinking about aspects of this. So, you know, when I get the calls from the wards to say, oh, can you come up and do an advanced care plan with someone? And I'm like, tell me what's happening. They're like, oh, they're going home in like 2 hours. So can you come up and do it before lunch? I'm like, no, I'll come up and say hi to them. I'll introduce the concept to them and we'll follow them up. But I will not be writing a plan with them for the first time in like 10, 15 minutes. That's just not kind of how it works. It's a process. But I think with the current frameworks we've got, and there's a new amazing resource that's just been designed by our Māori community for Māori to introduce advanced care planning called Te Whenua. Both of those documents really support people to do a lot of the thinking themselves. And actually we find that people can do quite a lot of the filling in of the documentation independently. They don't need that clinician oversight. Section 6, the kind of goals of care, advanced directives bit, that's the bit we ask to have that clinical guidance on. But the who I am, the what's important to me, the what I value, the how I make decisions, the what I want after I die, that's their stuff. You know what I mean? They can't really get that wrong because that's about what matters to them. So we don't necessarily need to be having huge amounts of oversight and support around that. We just need to make sure that what they're capturing in that kind of aligns and makes sense with what they're talking about in that more specific kind of goals of care and directive part of the process.
So you may have already answered the 2 questions that have come in, but is it too early to ever start those conversations or start an advanced care plan?
I don't think so. I say to people, you know, this is thinking that every competent adult should do. And actually the campaign we're about to run is with a whole lot of young people, because we're hearing a lot from our communities that this is something that we actually need to be starting really early in someone's lifetime. They mightn't choose to write it down in a plan, and that's okay. advanced care planning isn't about the documentation necessarily. That's useful for us as the clinicians because it gives us a touchstone to use. But the most important part of advanced care planning is thinking and the kōrero, the conversations, the discussions with the people you love. You know, and that's when you can use that as part of those ascertainable preferences. When you're talking to someone, if things are changing, it's like, you know, did your mum ever talk about what she'd want? You know, have there been situations with other members of your family? Do you know what she thought in those situations? Those discussions that you've had as part of that kōrero as a whānau, those are the things that then really help us to know going forward. It's when you have discussions with whānau, they're like, oh, we've never talked about it, or she tried to tell me that, but I didn't want to hear it because I told her she was going to live forever and it was going to be fine. That's when it's tough. So it's about encouraging our wider communities to be more open and feel confident to have some of these conversations in kōrero. And we're really lucky across the motu. We've got amazing communities that are supporting us with that. There's amazing work happening out of Wellington at the moment with the Samoan community. There's awesome work. Ruatori has been doing some pretty cool stuff happening in the advanced care planning and sort of the kaupapa hapori space up there. So there's a lot of work happening to kind of really think about how we can harness the skills and the resources and the amazingness of communities and really make that be part of the process as well.
Well, that about wraps up our questions actually for the evening. So thank you again, Jane, very much for taking your time to present this evening. To everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So thank you again, Jane, and have a lovely night, everyone. Stay safe.
Kia ora, ka kite anō.